to a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello, this is Collett Smart. I'm a psychologist and a teacher, and I'm your host on Raising Teens. As a parent, I know that raising a teenager can be an incredible, exhilarating, and joyous journey. It can also be confusing and really lonely at times. On this podcast, we are going to be joined by well-known experts where we chat about some of the most common questions that I get asked about raising teenagers in my own work. Our episodes are jam-packed with support so that you can get on with the job that you do best. That is, connecting with, supporting, and loving your teen. Ebony Birch-Hanger is a well-known speaker in the education, disability, and advocacy fields. She's a qualified special education teacher and teacher of the deaf. Ebony has worked primarily as a neurodevelopmental therapist, educational consultant, and music specialist. She supports individuals with a variety of additional needs, with 80% of her clients being on the autism spectrum. She consults to schools, local councils, and government levels. She also presents regular parent workshops and teacher professional development through her private practice. Ebony also draws on her personal, lived experience as an autistic individual. Hello, Ebony. Thank you so much for coming on Raising Teens.
Thanks so much for having me, Collett. It's great to be here.
So, Ebony, I actually did my postgrad with a specialisation in supporting children with special educational needs, and I worked in a school in Sydney for a while as their special education consultant when I came to Australia. But that was many years ago now, and the neurodiversity movement only really emerged during the 90s. And I think even up to 20 years ago, we didn't have the kind of resources available to us that we have now for supporting neurodiverse children and teens. So tell me a little bit about your journey and your background and how you got into the work that you do.
So I guess I've always had an intuitive ability to identify those with differences or those individuals who didn't quite fit the mold or who needed extra support. So right from my childhood years and teenage years, my mum's a teacher and I used to work with her in her classroom sometimes. And I just seemed to have this, as I say, intuitive ability to pick out the children in her class who needed that extra support. And I would gravitate towards them and assist them while I was there. That eventually led on to me deciding to do teacher training once I'd left high school. And that led me to working with one child as part of my training. And my client base then grew from there. So I did mainstream teaching for a couple of years, but I then left that to go into private practice and built up my client base from there. Families always questioned, I guess, how I could understand their children so well, especially non-speaking individuals. And then I had a late diagnosis as autistic when I was 28. And then it all made sense as to why I guess I could relate to the individuals that I worked with quite easily. So that's where I've come from.
Incredible. So you might be wondering what the term neurodiverse means, or neurodiversity. Harvard describes neurodiversity as the idea of the person's experience and their interaction with the world around them being in many different ways. So there's no one right way of thinking or learning or behaving, and differences are not viewed as deficits. So the word neurodiversity really refers to the diversity of all people. It's often used in context of autism spectrum disorder, as well as other neurological or developmental conditions such as ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or learning disabilities. The neurodiversity movement emerged during about the 1990s, and they aimed to increase acceptance and inclusion of all people while embracing neurological differences. In today's podcast, we are focusing on autistic teens. So today's topic comes from a question that was sent in a couple of months ago. Here is the question from Kay.
How do I help my teen son on the autism spectrum with friendships? He struggles to do things outside school and struggles to bond with children his own age. How do I help him to have healthy and supportive relationships? If you have any questions of your own, we here at Raising Teens would love to hear from you. You can send us a message using the link in the show notes.
So then I think someone like you is the best person to ask. There's been this myth that you will know, Ebony. It keeps going around that autistic teens aren't actually interested in interacting or having friendships. It doesn't bother them. I mean, for decades, we even saw scientists and clinicians and teachers believe that autistic people don't have friends, but they're not really interested in forging friendships. Yet we actually do see that autistic teens can and do form friendships with both neurotypical and autistic peers. So can you just explain for me why we now recognize that that is an incorrect assumption?
Yeah, so I guess this assumption comes from very outdated and limited understanding of autism. Back from the days when it was considered a boys-only condition, which we now know is not the case. It was considered very much a linear spectrum from, very mild to very severe, terms that aren't used these days. It was from a time when autism was considered to be a condition where all autistic individuals had a very low IQ, which we also know is now not the case, and back to when it was basically referred to as a psychological disturbance, including the desire to actually be isolated. So that's where that assumption has come from. And I believe that was just due to, a very limited understanding of what the condition is and how it can present.
I'm so glad you highlighted that, where we actually used to see people on the spectrum as these two extremes, limited understanding, low IQ, or the opposite was that kind of savant characteristic or the person who was this genius. All we ever knew was really the Rain Man kind of character. I actually heard recently or saw on Facebook, I think it was, this beautiful image of the light spectrum or the color spectrum. And someone saying we often see or think about people with autism as being on the spectrum in terms of extremes. And actually what they're thinking about is ranges, and that is incorrect. We actually need to think of it as a color spectrum where yellow isn't worse off than blue or better off than green. They're each different and unique in their own way. That was one of the most beautiful pictures I think I've seen in a while. So in terms of behaviors and interactions with friends, they can sometimes still be misinterpreted by parents or teachers as disinterest. What are we looking for? What are the signs we're looking for there so that we can actually support our autistic teens?
Yeah, so I think it's really signs of uncertainty that are misinterpreted as disinterest. And some of those signs are, not participating in conversation. And that can be for a range of reasons. It could be declining invitations to go out, removing themselves from environments that are overstimulating, or maybe withdrawing and sitting in the corner. It could be speaking at length about topics of interest to themselves, or it could be not maintaining conversation, so not responding to text messages from people or taking a long time to respond to text messages. So all of those, differences in the ways that an individual on the spectrum may interact are often misinterpreted as disinterest, when it's just a difference in communication style. And sometimes it's just about the individual protecting themselves in an environment that is overstimulating or overwhelming.
Yeah, and so sometimes those environments, I'm glad you highlighted that sense of overwhelm for our autistic teens and how it's not disinterest to them. Sometimes it's just a coping mechanism for them if they withdraw or some of the symptoms that you highlighted there. So our listener, Kay, talks about the challenges that her son is facing with friendships. Talking before to you a little bit, you actually asked me to frame it as challenges rather than struggles. I'd love you to talk about why you say that and how that can be kind of empowering. Why do you prefer that term challenges?
Yep. So language is very, very important. And I believe that, unless an individual tells me that they're struggling, I won't assume that they are.
So assuming perhaps Kay's son uses the word struggle, she would use the word struggle. But perhaps as professionals, we wouldn't use that word without using the language that the child is using themselves.
Absolutely. So if her son was saying that he struggles with making friendships, then that's fine to acknowledge that, because that's come from him and that's how he feels. But generally, I would use the word challenge just because it's much more general, and it's acknowledging that there's, some differences or potentially difficulty there, but it's not placing an assumption on that person when they haven't actually communicated what the situation is like for them.
Language matters. It does have an effect on how our teens think about themselves and their world. And in many areas of our society, there's lots of conversations about what to call somebody or how to refer to somebody. And in lots of these discussions, we hear person-first language. For example, a person with Down syndrome. However, many people in the autistic community prefer identity-first language, such as being an autistic teen. It can be tricky to change our language, especially if you have always had a certain way of thinking or you've been raised in a certain way. And there's no one size fits all. The most important thing is to talk to the person. Ask, what language do you prefer? I mean, at the end of the day, it's about respect and love and understanding. And I think we see this all the time working with autistic teens. Language is so important if we're going to actually connect with them in appropriate ways for them in their situation. And so coming back to Kay's question and the challenges that her son is facing with friendships, I know this is really something that parents with autistic teens are concerned about a lot. Their children, I mean, I've even seen it in my own practice as a psychologist. Some neurodiverse teens have found those social interactions challenging because, as you said, their interactions look quite different to what their neurotypical peers are doing on the playground or in the classroom. And sometimes they would say or do things that their peers would regard as odd or quirky. They're often open to bullying because the playground can be a really cruel place. And so our teens on the spectrum can be really vulnerable. And so can you chat with us a little bit about some of the reasons why kids on the spectrum find it difficult to make friends with peers of their own age?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a classic example of this. I would always interact with children much younger than myself or with adults, so my mum's peers, basically. The reasons I believe I did this and a lot of other individuals will do so is because a lot of maintaining relationships with same-age peers involves small talk. So a lot of that can just be seen as superfluous chatter. It's not particularly meaningful. And individuals on the spectrum can sometimes find, not see the purpose behind all of that chatter. And therefore it can be difficult to maintain a conversation with a lot of that going on. When you're interacting with a same-age peer, it can often also involve a lot of disagreement and conflict. And that can be something that individuals on the spectrum aren't particularly comfortable with and find it difficult to navigate due to differences in language or difficulties expressing needs and emotions. When you're interacting with older individuals, often I have always found that I can have much more meaningful conversations. Individuals who are older than me may have a lot more knowledge on a wider variety of topics and particularly my topics of interest, and therefore I can have a much more detailed conversation with them than I could with my same age peers. If we then look at younger children, often younger children will look up to an older child or a teen, which means that the autistic teen can use their own ideas and their own interest areas to actually lead younger children in play, which can give them that sense of confidence and empowerment as well. So that's a few reasons why both the older and the younger individuals can be sometimes easier to associate with and interact with.
Thank you for sharing your own experience. And I've seen it described that autistic adolescents can really work twice as hard intellectually at school than their peers because they're actually learning both the academic and the social curriculum. And so what you've described can sound really exhausting for some of our teens.
Absolutely.
Moving into high school, there's a lot less structure in some ways, and relationship interactions can become a lot less clear. So environments like the high school playground and even social media can leave our autistic teens a lot more vulnerable. I asked Leonie Smith about autistic teens' vulnerabilities online. Leonie is an e-safety educator and coach and has been a national cyber safety ambassador with the Australian government.
A lot of it is the same as what it is offline. It's the social skills, the misreading things. So you might have a child, for instance, that has the same social skills issues offline as online. You know, they're constantly texting someone over and over and over and over again. You know, like, why aren't you answering me? Why aren't you answering me? It's not understanding that there is actually an online culture. There's also an online etiquette. We all have to learn online etiquette because people aren't going to answer your email within 5 minutes. It's not like picking up the phone, talking to someone. And people that are neurodiverse have to learn the same things as well. They have to learn the online etiquette, and it's harder for them. And how to read text rather than, they struggle even reading people's faces and emotions and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, you're asking them to do that in a two-dimensional field, which is really tricky. So parents have to be engaged with that. So I can remember with my son, there was some big drama happened in Minecraft because one of them killed off somebody's pigs or something like that. And I got a call from the parent, and because the older boys were picking on the young one. So there was a lot of social skills that were learnt through that online space about the types of things that you could and couldn't do. And it's about not going up to people in online spaces and just introducing yourself. Half of them, they don't introduce themselves to another person. They just go up and blurt out something, whatever it might be. My son used to walk up to people and say, "Hello, do you believe in the Big Bang Theory?" And the 5-year-old would say, "What?" And he'd start explaining it to them, and that was his way of connecting. So, it's the same thing. So it can set them up to be bullied. Quite a lot of kids that are neurodiverse get abused and bullied online because they don't behave in a way that's socially acceptable, not just offline, but in that online culture, which is slightly different and nuanced as well. There's different platforms have different ways of communicating with each other. You can follow people on Twitter easily and it's not seen as creepy. But if you send someone a friend request on Facebook and you don't know them, that might be seen as creepy. So there's different online nuances that a parent may not understand. So they can get bullied, and it was one of my main concerns, and my son did get bullied online, and it was exactly for the reasons I've just said. He misread something in the comments and said something, somebody else misread that, it turned into a pile-on. There was no parent or adult in the room until I noticed him bashing away his keyboard and sighing and everything. And that's why I say to parents, you've got to have the kids in the room with you. You mightn't be able to see their screen. You mightn't understand what's going on the screen, but if you can see how they are emotionally reacting to that screen, you can stop something from going too far.
Yeah. Yeah. And also another aspect, I think a positive aspect that you've kind of touched on there is we can use kids being online to teach social skills. And I know that experts in the neurodiverse space talk about finding places online where neurodiverse young people can find their tribe. Because sometimes you can actually find a community or someone who has something that you absolutely love and you have a connection with. And so that is something positive. Has that come up at all in your work or with your children?
Yes, it absolutely has. And it might be around a game. It's really interesting. I had some clients who wanted to find a tribe for their daughter in that space. And it's very tricky to do sometimes because whilst there are groups set up for neurodiverse young people, that mightn't be a place that a young person feels comfortable with because it may be the only thing that connects them to that particular group is the fact that they're all neurodiverse. And it's like people say, you meet one person on the spectrum and you've met one person on the spectrum. They're all very, very different. Whereas what you might find is it might be a game like, for instance, Elden Ring, that's really popular amongst a lot of people that like sort of fantasy games, or, it might be Skyrim. And then you'll go onto a Discord server where people do nothing but talk about whatever that game is. And you might develop a relationship with other people that are playing that game. Now, obviously, there's no way in the world I would recommend that any young person under the age of 18 start to do that kind of stuff, particularly if they're neurodiverse, because you don't know who they're meeting. But certainly as you get older, that's a possibility. It would be better, and I know that there are some clinics around that help neurodiverse young people where they might, for instance, have a Dungeons and Dragons game that goes on. So my son's in a Dungeons and Dragons online team, and he's been playing that all through COVID online with the people that he used to play offline with, and these are personal friends of his. But he met his team locally and they connected over that. So it's like anyone. You connect with people that have a common interest with you. So for neurodiverse kids, whatever their speciality is, it may not be gaming. It might be something else that they're into. It might be art, or it might be some other activity. Finding that connection with parents offline, if you can do that, and then developing the connection online with parental supervision might be the way to go.
Ebony also had some advice for us on dealing with the nuances in high school through what we call a social story. And so, Ebony, sometimes it becomes a lot more evident in high school that our teens are finding something challenging. They may already have had a diagnosis when they're in primary school. Sometimes we actually only suddenly see behaviours that lead us to pursue a diagnosis in high school. Why do we see something change in high school compared to primary school for our autistic young people?
So I think, as most people will remember from their high school years, there's many more cliques, as they're known, or groups in high school as compared to primary school. And each of those cliques or groups have particular strong interest. So if there's an autistic teen who can't find a group that shares their interests, that can make it very difficult to sort of make their way into a group and feel like they belong. In primary school, there's less well-established groups, but even within the groups that do exist at the primary level, it's much easier to kind of flow between groups at that age. And I believe this is in a large part due to there being many more games played at primary school. Recess and lunch are very much games-based, yes. A lot more sport, a lot more, pretend play even in the younger years. Whereas in high school, it's basically just sit down and talk. It's very much conversation-based. And as I briefly touched on before, conversations can be very challenging for individuals on the spectrum for a number of reasons. It can be difficult to enter a conversation, find a way into a conversation, then to follow a group conversation when there's multiple speakers and those speakers are continually changing. There'll be lots of differing opinions within a group at high school age, and it can be difficult for an autistic teen to assert themselves within that group. They can also be very open to manipulation and be very, very vulnerable. And that's not particularly an issue in the primary school years, just because of, typical development and puberty and hormones. That completely changes the state of play once we reach high school. So that's why it's much more challenging in the high school years, and difficulties with friendships become much more evident because it's not quite as easy to blend in as it is in the primary school years.
Yeah, and I think there's so many nuances in high school that's the nature of high school. I know in psychology, and definitely in your work, you would have worked with teens on what we refer to as social stories. Would you be able to explain that a little bit, what a social story is?
So look, social stories are used for a number of different purposes. Sometimes they can be used very well. Sometimes people have a little bit of a misunderstanding about how they can best be used. The idea of a social story is really to give an individual an understanding of what a situation or an event might look like. So who is going to be involved? Where are they going to be? So give them some information about the location, information about the environment. It might be anything that they're usually sensitive to or any potential triggers that could upset them. Will any of those be present? And if so, how will their support people be prepared to support them in that situation? So that's what I would explain as the intended purpose of a social story. So it can just give a teen on the spectrum an understanding of what's going to happen before they get there. So it's a good way to prepare for what lies ahead so that they can begin to feel comfortable with what's going to occur in the future. The unintended or incorrect, for want of a better word, use of a social story is when people write things such as, I am going to go on this school excursion and I'm going to have a great time. I'm going to be nice to the friends in my group, so it's telling the individual what they are going to do and how they're going to feel. And I don't believe that that's an appropriate use of a social story because it's taking away validation from that individual and it's not allowing them to have the experience and then during that experience, express how it is for them and gain the support that they need. So really we want to use them just for preparation and to allow the individual to prepare, but not to tell them what they are going to do and how they are going to act and how they are going to feel in that moment.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. So, obviously we know that social connection is such a powerful protector of long-term physical and mental health, and there's a lot of studies that have shown that autistic children can be lonelier than their neurotypical peers. And I think I hear that in Kay's question and her story about her own son. She's concerned about his loneliness. And we also know that autistic teenagers typically have fewer friends and they meet friends less often in school or for shorter durations than their peers. And so it's not being unrealistic in saying your child needs 10 friends to experience the benefits of connection, but even 1 or 2 meaningful friendships or relationships can make a difference for our autistic teens in terms of their well-being. So what are some of your ideas or ways that you would encourage a parent like Kay to help her teen to forge these healthy, supportive friendships?
In general, the first thing I always say is start from their areas of interest. That is how they are going to be able to form friendships. So advice groups or some therapists even make the suggestion of, look, don't let them spend too much time on their interest area because, they'll block out everything else and they'll only be very narrowed in what they like and what they're exposed to. My approach would be the complete opposite. It would be to start from their areas of interest because when there is motivation, that's when they're more likely to form connections with other individuals. And when an individual is interested in something, they're going to be much more relaxed as well. So they're not going to be as stressed. When you're stressed or you're anxious, it's very difficult to form friendships. So starting from interest areas, also looking for like-minded individuals. So it may be finding autism-specific groups, autism-specific social activities so that they can associate with individuals who may have similar support needs to themselves and where they're not going to be judged for, any of those differences from their neurotypical peers that we may see. I wouldn't be too concerned about age differences. So we've already discussed the difficulties with same age peers. So if they're making friends with people who are in a different age group from them, as long as they are healthy relationships, I wouldn't be concerned about that. I also wouldn't be concerned if they're just forming strong relationships with family members. It doesn't necessarily have to be friends. It can be people inside the family that they are developing strong relationships with. And those are really positive relationships to have as well. Something I encourage parents to try and avoid is forcing friendships. So trying to choose a person that you think will be suitable and trying to force your child through love, obviously, to interact with particular people, because that's usually just going to result in them doing the exact opposite of what you're intending for them to do. And I would always be guided by mental health. So you mentioned before, Collett, that individuals may only have one or two friends, sometimes parents really worry about that. Oh, there's only one or two people they connect with.
Yes.
If they are really strong and healthy relationships and supportive relationships, and you're not concerned about your child's mental health, then that's okay. I would only start wanting to investigate making a wider circle of friends if you are concerned about your teen's mental health. If you feel that the fact they've only got one close friend is causing them to feel isolated or depressed and they don't feel like they have enough friends, then of course you can try and support them to develop more. But if they are quite happy with the one or two that they have and there are no mental health concerns, then again, I don't see that as an issue.
And that brings to mind, when I was working as a school psychologist, we worked with a girl in one of the schools that went all the way from preschool. They had a preschool on the school all the way to year 12. And she just didn't seem to have people to interact with during lunch and recess. And so what we did was we got her involved in assisting in the preschool or the prep during recess and lunch. And she loved it because the little kids just looked up to her. She had somewhere to go during the day that she felt useful, and she was interested in working with children, but she had a group or a few friends outside of school that she could work with. So it's important, I think, for parents to really advocate for their child at school, to find ways that their children are not completely isolated at school. So thank you for just really focusing on the child's mental health, because for her that worked at school, she was happy with that. Even though she didn't have a friend at school, it didn't affect her mental health because she had people outside. So yeah, and I think also for parents to keep in mind that at the end of the day, for some of our autistic teens, they can be utterly exhausted because they have spent the entire day, as I said, using both their cognitive and social functions. They're trying to learn almost two scripts or two intellectual areas all day, and they're exhausted. And so for parents to just be okay with them needing some downtime, do you just have any quick tips on that? What you would advise for parents at the end of a day for an autistic teen?
Well, I can even link that back to the listener's question, because I think Kay mentioned her son was having difficulty forming friendships after school or engaging in activities after school. And the reason I believe that would be is I think that's actually bigger than just friendships. I would suggest that that is heavily related to fatigue. It could be also heavily related to the environment. So potentially activities that they've tried, the environment is just too overstimulating. There could be lots of triggers or lots of stresses, too much sensory input going on. So another way to try and assist with friendships, particularly if you're trying to engage your children in activities after school, is to think about the environment that those activities are in. Also to ask your teen what they want. We often forget to do that. Ask your child what they want, and also how can you help. So you could ask your teen, look, I'm noticing, or you've told me that you're finding it difficult to make friends, or you're finding it difficult to attend this activity after school. Is there a way I can help you? Can I help you to communicate with people when you're there? Can I help you to get prepared for this activity? Can I organise the equipment that you need to take with you to go? So just ask your teen if there's anything you can do to help set them up for those activities. And then the other important thing is those healthy and supportive relationships. So we want to make sure that if they're engaging in activities, whether it be after school or at any other time, that they're engaging with people who respect their boundaries. So that may be, I've just come out from a long day of school. When they're at the activity after school with a peer group, they may just want to text. They may not want to talk. So being with a peer group who respect that boundary and understand that it's difficult for them to verbally communicate after a long day of school, and will respect their boundary to only communicate via text. Other things such as developing assertiveness in your teen, developing their ability to set their own boundaries and their own limits, and developing self-advocacy skills so that if they're in a situation that they're finding challenging, they can go to a trusted adult in that support group or come to their parent afterwards and explain what they were finding challenging and what supports that they potentially need to make that activity more easily accessible for them.
Thank you. That's so good. So finally, Ebony, what is your hope for the work that you do or for the teens that you work with?
My hope is that I can keep using my lived and professional experience to empower individuals and families and educators and arm them with knowledge to make change at the government and institution levels, because we really need it to be a top-down approach. To continue to present workshops, which is something that I love doing, and creating new ones. I love it when I get, an email from a random person that I haven't met before who's heard of me somewhere and says, I really need some information on this topic. And I will put together a new workshop based on, the information that they are requesting. And an area I'm really, really passionate about now, particularly because of my own experiences throughout the pandemic and how that has affected me, is using my work to support positive mental health and wellbeing. That to me is now the absolute number one, whether it be looking at friendships, whether it be looking at, academics, whether it be looking at getting into the workforce. You can't do that if you have challenges with mental health. So prioritising your teens' mental health and wellbeing to me is the number one suggestion that I can give all parents listening, because it's when they feel supported and they feel well and healthy and calm and relaxed that they will actually be able to develop skills in a wide range of areas and be successful in whatever it is that they would like to do with their time.
Ebony's encouragement to get behind our autistic teens' area of interest was just fantastic advice. She said, celebrate the areas and the people they thrive with and just support that rather than us trying to force friendships or activities that just utterly exhaust them. Really, it's just ultimately what will be good for their mental health, isn't it? If you would like to know more about Ebony's work, you can find her at ebonybirchhanger.com. You can also find me or leave a question for a future episode at raisingteenagers.com.au or via the Raising Teens page at hopepodcast.com.au. Please subscribe and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'd love to see you next episode, and in the meantime, keep parenting with your teen's future adult in mind.
This episode was hosted by Collett Smart, edited and produced by Alec Green, imaging by Lucy Weil, and social media by Beth Rivers.
Hope 1032. Thanks for listening.